9 minutes. That's all it took. Not 9 days of emergency diplomacy, not 9 weeks of back-channel negotiations. 9 minutes. 540 seconds. And when those 540 seconds were over, the most aggressive American trade ultimatum in modern history had been neutralized. Global markets were in free fall, and senior officials inside the White House were quietly asking each other a question nobody expected to be asking this early. What just happened? Tonight, we're going to answer that question, because what unfolded behind closed doors in Ottawa last week was not an accident. It was not improvisation. It was not panic dressed up as confidence. It was the most precisely engineered economic counterstrike ever deployed by a middle power against a superpower. And the man who designed it never raised his voice once. This is the story of how Canada's 9-minute maneuver just rewrote the rules of North American trade. To understand why 9 minutes matters, you first have to understand what Washington believed it was doing. For weeks before the ultimatum was issued, the mood inside senior U.S. trade offices had been one of quiet confidence. The plan was considered airtight. The leverage was considered overwhelming. And the assumption, the deeply, dangerously comfortable assumption, was that Canada would do what Canada always does: absorb the pressure, consult some officials, issue a measured statement, and eventually find its way to the negotiating table on American terms. That assumption was not born from arrogance. It was born from history. Because for decades, the history of trade confrontations between Washington and Ottawa had followed a predictable script. The United States escalates, Canada responds. Tensions simmer, diplomats talk, a deal gets made. Everyone moves on. Quietly, professionally, without anyone losing too much face. That script had played out so many times, in so many forms, across so many administrations, that it had become something close to institutional reflex inside Washington trade circles. You push Canada, Canada pushes back just enough to save domestic credibility, then Canada finds a way to settle. The ultimatum itself was designed around that exact logic. It was not a negotiation. It was not an invitation. It was structured, deliberately and explicitly, as a pressure ceiling, a final number, a deadline, a take-it-or-leave-it document that gave Ottawa a narrow window to signal compliance before consequences began. Tariffs so severe they would effectively restructure the Canadian export economy overnight. Levies targeting the sectors Canada most depended on for stability. The kind of numbers that make finance ministers go pale and markets start pricing in catastrophe before the ink is even dry. And Washington gave Canada 72 hours to respond. 72 hours sounds like time. It sounds like room to breathe, room to consult, room to bring in negotiators and economists and legal teams and start drafting a counter-proposal. That was the calculation. 72 hours of uncertainty is politically excruciating. Markets hate uncertainty. Business leaders call their representatives when they sense uncertainty. Premiers and governors start making noise. The pressure of 72 hours, properly applied, is not relief. It is a slow, methodical tightening of the vice. Washington settled in and waited. What they expected was a process. What they got was a response. Not in 72 hours, not in 72 minutes. In 9. Here is the thing nobody inside the White House Trade Office had fully accounted for. Mark Carney is not a politician who studied economics. He is an economist who became a politician. That distinction sounds subtle. It is not subtle at all. Carney spent his career inside the architecture of global financial crises. He ran the Bank of Canada through 2008, the year the entire Western financial system nearly came apart at the seams. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit, the most chaotic voluntary economic self-disruption a major democracy had attempted in living memory. He did not just observe those crises from a position of authority. He made the decisions. He designed the responses. He sat in rooms with people who had just been told the ground beneath them was cracking, and he had to explain, with precision, exactly which lever to pull, and in which order, and with what force. That experience does something to a person. It removes a certain kind of fear. Not recklessness, not arrogance, something more specific. It removes the fear of complexity. Because once you have navigated a genuine systemic crisis, once you have felt the weight of a decision that moves markets and affects millions of people, a trade ultimatum from a country that still needs your oil starts to look less like an emergency and more like a problem set, one you have, in all likelihood, already solved on paper. According to people familiar with the internal deliberations inside the Prime Minister's office, Carney had not waited for the ultimatum to begin preparing. He had been preparing since the first signals of American trade aggression surfaced earlier in the year. While public attention was fixed on the political rhetoric, the tariff threats, the taunts, the headlines, a quiet and extraordinarily disciplined process was already underway inside Ottawa's economic task force. Scenario planning, commodity mapping, supply chain vulnerability analysis on the American side, not the Canadian side, legal review of every export permitting mechanism Canada possessed. The kind of work that does not make news until suddenly, one day, it is the only news. The 9-minute response was not improvised in the aftermath of the ultimatum. It had been sitting in a drawer, fully formed, waiting for the moment the ultimatum arrived. Washington pulled the trigger. Ottawa opened the drawer. The response was delivered at 11:07 in the morning. By 11:16, the phones on the trading floors of 3 major American financial institutions were ringing simultaneously with calls from their own risk desks. By 11:19, a senior official at the U.S. Trade Representative's office had been pulled out of a separate meeting to look at something on a screen. By 11:23, the first call from a Wall Street chief executive to a White House economic advisor had been placed. 9 minutes. 11 seconds over, if you count precisely. So, what was in the response? What exactly did Canada deploy in the space of 540 seconds that turned the most confident trade ultimatum Washington had issued in years into an emergency damage control situation before lunch? The answer comes down to one word: uranium. Not oil, although oil was in the document. Not lumber, although lumber was referenced. Not aluminum, not potash, not copper, not the dozens of other critical commodities that flow north to south across the longest shared border in the world every single day. Uranium. The one commodity on the list that American trade officials had apparently not built into their risk modeling with sufficient seriousness. The one commodity whose supply chain implications reached not just into the American economy, but into the American security apparatus in ways that could not be papered over with rhetoric or resolved with a counter-tariff. Here is what the American trade team had apparently failed to adequately calculate. The United States operates 93 commercial nuclear reactors. Those 93 reactors generate approximately 20% of the country's electricity. The fuel those reactors run on is uranium, and a significant and structurally embedded share of that uranium comes from Canada. Not because of sentimentality, not because of diplomatic courtesy, because of geology, existing contracts, refining infrastructure, and 2 decades of integrated supply chain development that cannot be replaced with a phone call or a new procurement agreement in 72 hours or 72 months. Canada's response did not threaten to cut off uranium overnight. Carney is too precise for that kind of blunt instrument escalation. What the response did was something far more sophisticated, and in the estimation of several market analysts who reviewed it within hours of its release, far more devastating. It formally placed uranium, alongside every other strategic Canadian export, inside a new sovereign licensing framework. One that established, in legally airtight language, that any nation engaged in what Ottawa termed coercive economic practices against Canada would face a prioritization review for export licensing. In plain terms, Canada reserved the right to move other buyers to the front of the line. Not a ban, a queue. And suddenly, every American energy executive and every Pentagon supply chain officer and every nuclear facility operator in 29 states was staring at the same uncomfortable question. Are we at the front of that queue? Are we confident we're at the front? And how confident were we, actually, given what just happened? That uncertainty, That single, expertly placed, precisely worded uncertainty, that was the weapon. Not the commodity itself, the doubt about access to the commodity. Because in energy markets and national security supply chains, doubt is the most expensive thing you can manufacture. Doubt makes investors reprice. Doubt makes executives call senators. Doubt makes the people whose job it is to guarantee stability suddenly uncertain about their own guarantee. Within the first hour after the response was delivered, uranium spot prices had moved. Within 2 hours, natural gas futures were reacting. By mid-afternoon, 3 separate American industry coalitions had issued statements urging the administration to seek a negotiated resolution. None of them used the word uranium publicly, but everyone who read those statements understood exactly what they were talking about. There is a version of this story that Washington had been telling itself for years. It goes something like this. The United States is Canada's largest trading partner, by an enormous margin. Nearly 3/4 of everything Canada exports flows south. American consumers buy Canadian oil at scale. American factories use Canadian aluminum. American construction depends on Canadian lumber. The economic dependency is so complete, so structurally embedded, that the leverage calculation is straightforward. Canada needs America more than America needs Canada. Therefore, America holds the cards. Therefore, pressure on Canada produces compliance from Canada. Therefore, an ultimatum framed in sufficiently serious terms will produce a negotiation on American terms. The logic is clean. The math seems obvious. And for a long time, it was at least partially true. But leverage is not static. Leverage is not a fixed attribute of size. Leverage is a relationship between what you can threaten and whether the threat actually changes the other person's behavior. And here is what the Trump trade team had apparently not modeled carefully enough. The leverage calculation changes dramatically when the country you are pressuring is not just an export economy, but a commodity supplier for things you cannot easily replace. Because there is a crucial difference between a country that sells you things you could theoretically buy elsewhere and a country that supplies inputs that are integrated into your infrastructure, your grid, your defense systems, your industrial base, at a level of depth that cannot be unwound in any time frame that is politically manageable. Canada is not simply a trading partner. In specific categories, Canada is a structural dependency. And the response that came back in 9 minutes was constructed precisely around the 10 commodities where that structural dependency was deepest, least flexible, and most dangerous to put at risk heading into a midterm election year. Carney had done the math. His economic task force had mapped every single American vulnerability. Not to be aggressive, not to threaten blindly, but to understand with the precision of a central banker and the patience of a chess player exactly which squares on the board the other side could not afford to lose. Then Ottawa placed those squares in play simultaneously, in one document, in one response, in 9 minutes. The ultimatum had been designed to take 72 hours to process. The response made it clear that Ottawa had processed it before it arrived. By early afternoon on the day of the response, something was happening inside American financial circles that had not happened in any previous iteration of this trade confrontation. Senior executives from industries with direct exposure to Canadian supply chains were making calls, not to each other, not to their lobbyists, to the White House. The calls were not angry. Anger would have been manageable. They were something worse. They were alarmed. Because the executives making those calls were not reacting to political drama or media coverage. They were reacting to their own risk analysis. Their own supply chain teams had spent the hours since the response was published running the same calculations Ottawa had already run. And the numbers coming back were not comfortable. Refineries in the Midwest with existing heavy crude contracts, power utilities in states bordering Canada with grid interconnects that ran in one direction, manufacturers with aluminum input requirements that were already priced into annual production budgets, construction conglomerates with lumber costs locked into project bids, and sitting above all of it, quieter than the rest but heavier than any of them, the nuclear operators and the defense supply chain officers who had spent the morning reviewing their uranium sourcing documents and realizing that the word strategic, as applied to Canadian commodities, had just taken on a meaning they had not previously given it sufficient weight. The calls to the White House were professional, measured. The language was careful. Nobody said surrender. Nobody said fold. What they said in various formulations was essentially the same message. We need clarity. We need to understand the timeline. We need to know whether the licensing framework in that document is immediate or conditional. And most importantly, we need you to understand that we cannot absorb a prolonged period of uncertainty around this. Not in Q4, not heading into planning cycles, not with the current cost environment. In political translation, that message had one meaning. This is costing you. Fix it. The White House had anticipated Canadian counterpressure. It had not anticipated the counterpressure arriving inside its own business community, inside the first afternoon. There is a psychological dimension to this story that almost nobody in the financial press has discussed, and it matters as much as the commodity economics. When a powerful party issues an ultimatum, there is an implicit assumption embedded in the structure of that ultimatum. The assumption is that the other side needs time to process the shock, time to consult internally, time to manage the emotional fallout. Time to reach the rational calculation that compliance is preferable to escalation. That time, that necessary pause, is what gives the ultimatum its psychological power. Because the pause creates a visible display of the power differential. You are rattled, I am waiting. That dynamic itself is leverage. A 9-minute response destroys that dynamic completely. A response in 9 minutes does not say, we have thought about your offer and declined. It says, we anticipated your offer before you made it. We prepared for it in advance. And we are not rattled because there is nothing here that surprised us. That message, delivered through the simple mechanism of speed, changes the entire psychological architecture of the confrontation. Because now the question is not whether Ottawa can survive the pressure. The question, suddenly and uncomfortably, is whether Washington understood the board it was playing on. Carney did not need to say that out loud. He did not need to hold a press conference or issue a statement describing his preparation. The 9 minutes said it for him, with the precision and economy of a man who has spent his entire career communicating through mechanisms rather than words. Trump expected urgency. He got a response that suggested Ottawa had been waiting for him to move. Trump expected fear. He got paperwork that had clearly been drafted before his ultimatum was written. Trump expected the weight of American economic size to be visible in the gap between his action and Canada's reaction. That gap was 9 minutes. And 9 minutes is not the gap between a superpower and a nation under pressure. 9 minutes is the gap between someone who asked a question and someone who already knew the answer. The response moved beyond North American trade circles faster than most observers expected. By the following morning, economic ministries in 3 European capitals had reportedly requested copies of the Canadian licensing framework for internal review, not because they expected to deploy it immediately, because they wanted to understand it. Because what Canada had done in 540 seconds was not just respond to an ultimatum, it was demonstrate a methodology. For years, the operating assumption in international trade circles had been that the United States, as the world's largest consumer market, held a structural negotiating advantage over virtually every other actor on the planet. Not because American tariff threats were always credible, but because the cost of provoking a prolonged confrontation with Washington was almost always higher than the cost of finding a face-saving accommodation. That asymmetry was the foundation of American trade leverage. Not power for its own sake, but the credibility of pain. Canada's 9-minute response introduced a crack into that foundation. Because what it demonstrated, for the first time with this level of precision and this level of public visibility, was that the asymmetry was not absolute. That a country positioned correctly, with the right commodity portfolio, the right legal architecture, the right preparation, and the right leader, could change the cost calculus inside a trade confrontation in a way that made prolonged escalation more expensive for the larger party than for the smaller one. Australia's trade ministry noted the maneuver without commenting on it directly. Japan's economic security team published an internal briefing that circulated beyond its intended audience. The European Commission's Trade Directorate, which had been managing its own tense relationship with Washington tariff threats for months, reportedly convened an informal session the week after the Ottawa response to discuss what one participant later described as the structural lessons of the Canadian approach. The phrase that began appearing in those conversations, in Brussels, in Tokyo, in Canberra, was not Trump or Carney or uranium or trade war. The phrase was supply chain sovereignty, the idea that a country's strategic commodity position, properly mapped and properly prepared, constituted a form of economic defense more durable than any tariff schedule and more credible than any diplomatic protest. Canada had not just responded to a trade ultimatum, it had published a new manual. Here is what we know with certainty as of today. The 72-hour ultimatum expired without the compliance Washington had anticipated. The 9-minute response remains on the table, legally active, structurally intact. The licensing framework Carney's team deployed is not a temporary bargaining position. It is legislation, passed, durable, designed explicitly to outlast any single administration in either capital. And the commodity at its center, the one that moved markets and moved phone calls and moved White House advisors out of their meetings, remains as structurally irreplaceable today as it was at 11:07 in the morning when Ottawa pressed send. What happens next will depend on which version of Washington shows up to the next conversation. Because there are, according to people with visibility into the internal debates, two distinct factions now operating inside the administration's trade strategy. The first believes that the correct response is escalation, that backing down in the face of a Canadian countermove sets a precedent that other trading partners will exploit, that the 9 minutes was a provocation, and provocations are answered with force, not with accommodation. This faction is loud. It has the president's instinctive sympathy, and it is, at least in the estimation of most market analysts who have reviewed the commodity exposure numbers, wrong. The second faction, quieter and growing more vocal by the day, believes that the correct response is to find a framework that allows both sides to declare an acceptable outcome without anyone using the word capitulation. This faction is watching the phone calls from Wall Street. This faction is reading the polls in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, where energy prices and manufacturing input costs are political weather, not abstractions. This faction understands that the 9-minute response was not designed to humiliate Washington. It was designed to create a cost that makes continued confrontation more expensive than a mutually acceptable resolution. Carney has not called for a press conference. He has not issued triumphant statements. He has not weaponized the moment for domestic political theater, although the domestic politics have moved substantially in his direction regardless. He has simply waited, quietly, with the specific patience of a man who knows exactly what the numbers show and is comfortable allowing those numbers to make his argument for him. Patience. It was the same quality that unnerved Washington at the beginning of this confrontation. It is the same quality that is unnerving them now. There will be a temptation in the days ahead to interpret this story as a story about Canada winning and America losing. That interpretation is wrong. And more importantly, it is exactly the kind of framing that makes resolution harder to find. What this story is actually about is something more fundamental than a trade dispute between two neighbors. It is about the conditions under which economic coercion works and the conditions under which it doesn't. Because coercion, in trade as in everything else, operates on a set of assumptions: that the target is sufficiently dependent, that the target lacks alternatives, that the target's political leadership will prioritize short-term stability over long-term positioning, that the pain of resistance exceeds the pain of compliance. Remove any one of those assumptions and the coercion starts to underperform. Remove all four simultaneously and the coercion doesn't just fail, it backfires. Because every public escalation that doesn't produce the expected compliance makes the next escalation less credible. Every deadline that passes without surrender signals to every other party watching that the ultimatum architecture has a flaw. And every phone call from a Wall Street executive who was supposed to be on your side suggests that the leverage you thought you had was not as complete as you believed. Canada removed all 4 assumptions in 9 minutes. Not because Ottawa is more powerful than Washington. It isn't. Not because Canadian GDP outweighs American GDP. It doesn't. But because Mark Carney had done the one thing that no amount of raw economic size can substitute for, he had mapped the board before the game began. He understood which squares the other side could not afford to lose, and he built a response that put precisely those squares in play, in a document clean enough to be legally binding and fast enough to be psychologically devastating. Trump had power. Carney had a plan. And in the contest between power without preparation and a plan built from preparation, the plan wins. Not because it is louder, not because it carries more force, but because it was already finished when the other side thought the game was just beginning. 9 minutes, 540 seconds, and the rules of North American trade will not look exactly the same again. So I want to leave you with a question, because this story is still unfolding, and the next move from Washington has not yet been made. What does a superpower do when the playbook it has relied on for decades stops producing the expected result? Does it escalate, hoping that more pressure will eventually break through? Does it recalibrate, looking for the framework that allows both sides to step back from the edge? Or does it do something harder, something more uncomfortable? Does it look honestly at the 9-minute response and ask what it reveals not about Canada's strategy, but about American vulnerability? Because that is the question hiding inside this story. The uranium, the licensing framework, the commodity queue, the Wall Street phone calls, those are all visible. They are the mechanism. The deeper question is what the mechanism reveals, which is that the United States, for all of its economic scale and all of its historical leverage, had built trade dependencies it had not mapped, in commodities it had not protected, with a partner it had not taken seriously enough to study carefully before issuing an ultimatum. Canada didn't win this round because it is stronger than America. Canada won this round because it understood America better than America understood Canada. And that kind of asymmetry doesn't fix itself with tariffs. It fixes itself with honesty. And honesty, as we have seen repeatedly in this confrontation, is in very short supply in Washington right now. Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Does Washington escalate and absorb the consequences? Does it find a face-saving resolution before the commodity markets do any more damage? Or does this 9-minute maneuver mark something bigger, the moment that middle powers around the world started reading a different playbook entirely? I read every single comment. Stay sharp, and I will see you in the next one.